October 24, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The machine gun barrel was still hot when George S. Doc Rowe found it. His hands, trained for 15 months to tie tourniquets, pack wounds, inject morphine, now gripped steel that wasn't supposed to belong to him. The M1917 Browning, water-cooled, .30 caliber, fed by cloth belts that snaked across the muddy ground like dead pythons. The gun crew was scattered around the position, 3 Marines, eyes open, not moving. Doc Rowe's medical bag lay 5 feet behind him. He dropped it when he ran. The silence where thunder should have been. That's what made him run. His aid station was 30 yards back, tucked behind a fallen mahogany tree the size of a city bus. He'd been cleaning instruments in boiled rainwater when the sound stopped. Machine guns don't stop during a banzai charge. They fire until barrels melt or men die. When they go quiet, it means one thing: breakthrough. The Japanese soldiers were already through the gap when he reached the gun pit, 20 yards out, maybe less. Their bayonets caught moonlight filtered through triple canopy jungle. They were running hard, screaming "Banzai!" with voices hoarse from 3 days without water. They'd expected to find a silent gun and scattered Americans. They found Doc Rowe instead. His first burst was instinct, pure, unthinking. The Browning roared back to life. George S. Rowe had never fired a machine gun in combat before that night. His job was the opposite of killing. While other sailors learned to aim and shoot, he learned where to cut and how deep to stitch. While they practiced with rifles, he practiced with scalpels. The Navy trained him for 6 months at Course School in San Diego, where the Pacific Ocean looked clean and blue and nothing like the fever soup waters around Guadalcanal. They taught him anatomy, pharmacology, emergency field procedures, how to pack a sucking chest wound with petroleum gauze, how to splint a compound fracture using tent poles and undershirts, how to identify gangrene by smell alone, sweet like rotten fruit mixed with copper. They taught him to work fast, work dirty, and never promise anyone they'd live. But they never taught him this. The M1917 cycled at 450 rounds per minute. Doc Rowe pulled the trigger and held it. The gun bucked against his shoulder, heavier recoil than he expected, more violent than any training film suggested. Brass casings ejected in a golden stream, pinging off the gun shield and falling into the mud that covered everything on Guadalcanal. The water jacket was already hot. Steam rose from the cooling system like a kettling engine. The first Japanese soldier dropped at 15 yards, then another, then 3 more in a cluster. Doc Rowe kept firing. Guadalcanal in October 1942 wasn't a battlefield. It was a biological nightmare masquerading as one. The island sat 8 degrees south of the equator, where humidity stayed locked at 90% and rain fell in sheets that turned foxholes into drowning pools. Temperatures hit 95 during the day, dropped to 80 at night. The jungle grew so thick that men walked 10 feet into the tree line and vanished from view. Everything rotted: boots, uniforms, skin. Wounds that would heal in California turned septic in hours here. Malaria took more men than bullets. Dengue fever, dysentery, tropical ulcers that ate through muscle down to bone. The Marines called it the Green Hell, and that was generous. Hell would have been drier. The 1st Marine Division had landed on August 7th. They'd secured Henderson Field, the airstrip that made Guadalcanal strategically vital, within hours. The Japanese wanted it back. They'd been trying to take it every night since. If the story you've heard about the Pacific War ends with Pearl Harbor and skips to Iwo Jima, understand this: Guadalcanal was where America learned to fight. Not against an enemy we understood, but against an enemy that charged machine guns with bayonets and considered death in battle the highest honor, against an enemy that fought until they were killed because surrender meant shame worse than death. And if you think that cultural gulf didn't matter, that war is war and violence is universal, then you've never tried to treat wounded men who begged you to let them die rather than be captured. Doc Rowe had, 17 times in 2 months. The machine gun nest sat on a slight rise, barely 3 feet of elevation, but on Guadalcanal that was a hill. It covered the approach to the American perimeter from the south, where the jungle pressed closest to Henderson Field. The gun had interlocking fields of fire with 2 other positions, one 50 yards left, one 50 yards right. Basic defensive doctrine, overlapping coverage, no gaps. Except now, there was a gap. Doc Rowe didn't know how the gun crew died. Maybe a grenade, maybe a sniper. Maybe they'd been overrun by an earlier wave he hadn't heard over the artillery. It didn't matter. What mattered was the Browning, and the belt of ammunition still feeding through it, and the Japanese soldiers who kept coming even as their comrades fell. His training said, get wounded men to safety, stabilize bleeding, clear airways, treat shock, get them back to the battalion aid station where real doctors could work. His training said nothing about this. The Browning's barrel glowed dull red in the darkness. The water in the cooling jacket was boiling. He could hear it, a rushing sound under the gunfire. Steam poured from the overflow valve. If he fired much longer, the barrel would warp and the gun would jam. Or explode. Behind him, someone was screaming for a corpsman. The voice was high and young and terrified. Doc Rowe's hands wanted to release the gun and grab his medical bag. Every instinct said, help him. That's your job. That's what you do. But if he left this gun, the Japanese would break through. They'd reach the aid station. They'd reach the wounded men who couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but lie in the mud and wait. Doc Rowe kept firing. He was 23 years old, born in Pennsylvania, small town, the kind where everyone knew your name and your father's name and what your grandfather did in the First War. He'd wanted to be a teacher, history maybe, or English, something that involved books and quiet classrooms and summers off. Then December 7th, 1941 happened. He enlisted on December 9th, not because he wanted to fight. He didn't particularly. Not because he hated the Japanese. He'd never met one before boot camp. He enlisted because every man his age was enlisting, and the alternative was to sit home and wonder what that made him. The Navy gave him a choice: gunnery school or hospital corps school. He chose medicine because it felt cleaner, more useful. You could save a man's life and not wonder if he had a family somewhere who'd get a telegram about him. Now he was firing a machine gun into the dark, watching men fall, and the only thing he felt was the mechanical rhythm of aiming and firing and traversing left and right to catch the ones who tried to flank. If you ever wondered what it takes to break a man's original nature, to turn someone whose hands were meant for healing into someone whose hands deal death, keep watching, because what happens next will show you exactly how thin that line really is. The first belt ran dry after 90 seconds. Doc Rowe's hands found the next belt without thinking. Muscle memory from the one familiarization class they'd given all Navy personnel in basic training. Thread the belt, slap the cover closed, charge the weapon. The Japanese were regrouping in the tree line, maybe 40 yards out. He could see them moving between the trees, shadows against shadows. Someone dropped into the gun pit beside him. A Marine. Couldn't have been older than 19. His rifle was gone. His helmet was cracked down the middle. Blood ran from his nose. Jesus Christ, the Marine said. You're a corpsman. Yeah. Doc Rowe kept his eyes on the tree line. Where's the gun crew? Dead. The Marine looked at the bodies, looked at Doc Rowe. How long you been firing? I don't know. You know how to operate that thing. I'm learning. The Marine started to laugh. A high, hysterical sound that he cut off by biting his knuckle. Then he grabbed a rifle from one of the dead gunners and positioned himself at the edge of the pit. All right, Doc, you keep that gun talking. I'll watch your flanks. His name was Private First Class James Mitchell, farm kid from Iowa. He'd been with the 1st Marines since boot camp. This was his 3rd banzai charge in a week. He had malaria, temperature of 103 when he'd checked that morning, but he was fighting anyway because every man who could hold a rifle was needed. They're coming again, Mitchell said. Doc Rowe saw them. More this time. 30 soldiers, maybe 40. They came in a wave, screaming that same word. Banzai! Banzai! Their voices merged into a single continuous roar that made his ears ring. The Browning opened up. Here's what doesn't make it into the history books. The sound. Not the gunfire. That's in every movie, every documentary, every veteran's story. But the other sounds. The wet thump of bullets hitting flesh. The clatter of equipment dropping. The screaming that doesn't stop when men go down. The wounded ones keep screaming until their lungs give out or blood fills their throats. Doc Rowe heard all of it. He tried not to listen. He tried to focus on the technical aspects. Traverse left, short bursts, don't overheat the barrel, watch your ammunition count, but the sounds got through anyway. They always did. Mitchell fired in controlled bursts beside him. His rifle had an 8-round clip. He went through 3 clips in less than a minute. Each time he reloaded, he said the same thing. counting, talking to himself, keeping calm. The Japanese reached 10 yards before the charge broke. The survivors retreated into the jungle. Doc Rowe counted 7 still moving. The rest weren't. He released the trigger. The Browning fell silent. His ears rang so badly he couldn't hear Mitchell talking to him. Okay? Doc, you hit? What? Are you hit? Doc Rowe checked himself. No blood, that was his. No, I'm good. Jesus. Mitchell slumped against the gun pit wall. Jesus Christ, you held them. You actually held them. Doc Rowe's hands were shaking now. Delayed reaction. His fingers cramped from gripping the gun. He tried to stand, and his legs didn't work properly. Knees weak, like he'd run 10 miles. The medical bag was still where he'd dropped it. He picked it up. The canvas was splattered with mud and something darker. Behind them, someone was still screaming for a corpsman. Go, Mitchell said. I got the gun. Go help them. Doc Rowe went. The wounded Marine was Corporal Eddie Santos from Chicago, 22 years old. Shrapnel from a grenade had torn through his left thigh. The femoral artery was intact. Doc Rowe checked that first because if it wasn't, Santos would be dead already. But the wound was deep, jagged, full of dirt and fabric from his torn utilities. Am I going to lose it? Santos asked. His voice was steady, too steady. Shock talking. No. Doc Rowe packed the wound with sulfa powder and gauze. But you're going to the aid station. Can't. They need every rifle. They need you alive more than they need you shooting. Doc Rowe tied off the bandage. Tight, but not tourniquet tight. Santos would keep the leg. Probably. If infection didn't set in, if gangrene didn't start, if 1,000 things that could go wrong on Guadalcanal didn't go wrong. 2 Marines appeared to carry Santos back. Doc Rowe watched them go, then returned to the gun pit. Mitchell was still there. Still watching the tree line, still holding that rifle. They'll come again, Mitchell said. I know. You did good, Doc. Real good. Doc Rowe didn't answer. He checked the Browning, changed the water in the cooling jacket. It had boiled down to half volume, counted the remaining ammunition belts. 4, maybe 500 rounds total. If the Japanese came in force again, it wouldn't be enough. They came again at 300 hours. This time, Doc Rowe saw them forming up. Maybe 100 soldiers. They'd brought a light machine gun, a Type 96, if he remembered the recognition training. They set it up in the tree line and opened fire. Bullets cracked over the gun pit. Mitchell ducked. Doc Rowe stayed on the Browning. The M1917 had better range, heavier caliber, more sustained fire. Doc Rowe aimed at the muzzle flash from the Japanese gun and held the trigger. Tracers streaked across the gap. The Japanese gun went silent. Then the charge came. They didn't scream this time. They came in silence, which was somehow worse. Shadows moving fast through the jungle. Doc Rowe fired in traversing bursts, left to right to left, catching them as they came through the gaps in the trees. Mitchell shot anything that got close. Rifle fire from the other American positions joined in. The night lit up with muzzle flashes. A Japanese soldier made it to the gun pit. Just one. He came over the edge with his bayonet forward and his eyes wide. Mitchell shot him at 3 feet. The soldier fell backwards into the mud. Doc Rowe kept firing. The charge broke after 2 minutes, maybe less. Time compressed during firefights. Seconds felt like hours. Hours felt like seconds. Doc Rowe's world narrowed to the gun sights and the tree line and the mechanical process of killing men who were trying to kill him. When it was over, Mitchell was crying, not sobbing. Just tears running down his face while he reloaded his rifle with hands that shook so badly he dropped 2 rounds in the mud. We held, Mitchell said. We held them again. Doc Rowe's throat was too dry to answer. His hands found his canteen, water that tasted like iodine and rust. He drank half, gave the rest to Mitchell. You know what you are, Doc? Mitchell said. You're a fucking hero. I'm not. Yeah, you are. Doc Rowe looked at the bodies in front of the gun pit. 20, maybe 30. Hard to count in the dark. These were men who'd had names, families, reasons for fighting. Now they were just shapes in the mud. He thought about his training, about the Hippocratic Oath he'd never technically taken, but understood anyway. First, do no harm. He'd harmed plenty tonight. I need to check the wounded, he said. Mitchell nodded. I'll watch the gun. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about the people history forgot, the ones who did impossible things in impossible situations. We're just getting started. The aid station was chaos. Wounded men everywhere, some quiet, some screaming, some unconscious. The battalion surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Harrison, a civilian doctor from Boston who'd joined the Navy 6 months ago, was operating by flashlight. He had a Marine on the table, chest cavity open, blood everywhere. He was trying to clamp a bleeder with hands that moved too fast, too desperate. "Doc Rowe," Harrison said without looking up. "Where the hell have you been?" "Machine gun nest. Had to hold it." "You're a corpsman." "Yes, sir." Harrison pulled a clamp tight. "Well, now you're back. Triage the new arrivals. Red, yellow, green. You know the drill." Doc Rowe knew the drill. Red meant immediate, life-threatening injuries that could be saved with quick intervention. Yellow meant urgent, serious injuries that could wait a few hours. Green meant walking wounded. Patch them up and send them back to their units. There was another category they didn't talk about. Black, too far gone. Make them comfortable. Give them morphine. Hold their hand if they ask. Let them die with dignity. Doc Rowe moved through the wounded. His hands worked automatically. Check pulse. Check breathing. Check for arterial bleeding. Assign color. Move on. A Marine with a sucking chest wound. Red. A Marine with a broken arm. Yellow. A Marine with shrapnel in his shoulder. Green. A Marine with his intestines exposed and his skin already gray. Black. The black tag Marine was 19. He grabbed Doc Rowe's wrist with surprising strength. "Am I dying?" "Yes." "Will it hurt?" "Not much." Doc Rowe loaded a syringe of morphine. 0.3 grains. Enough to take the edge off. Enough to make the end easier. "This will help." "I don't want to die here, Doc. This is a shit place to die." "I know." "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." "I will." The Marine closed his eyes. Doc Rowe stayed with him until his breathing stopped. Then he moved on to the next casualty. This was the job. This was what he'd signed up for. Save the ones you can. Comfort the ones you can't. Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't think. Don't feel. Don't feel. Dawn came slowly on Guadalcanal. The jungle stayed dark until the sun was fully up. Too many layers of canopy. But when light finally penetrated, it turned everything green. Sick green. Fever green. The color of rot and mold and things that grew in places they shouldn't. Doc Rowe returned to the gun pit at 600. Mitchell was still there, still awake. He hadn't moved in 3 hours. "They didn't come back," Mitchell said. "No." "Think they gave up?" "No." They looked at the bodies in front of the position. In daylight, they were men again. Young men. Some without weapons. They'd lost them in the charge. Some without boots. They'd been fighting that desperately. One soldier couldn't have been older than 16. His face was smooth, unlined. He still had baby fat in his cheeks. Doc Rowe felt nothing looking at him. That was the worst part. Not guilt, not horror, just emptiness where emotions should have been. A lieutenant from the 1st Marines appeared. He surveyed the scene, the bodies, the spent brass casings ankle-deep in the gun pit, the blown-out cooling jacket on the Browning that would need replacing. He looked at Doc Rowe. "You held this position alone?" "Private Mitchell helped." "Mitchell's got malaria. He shouldn't even be fighting." The lieutenant shook his head. "Who are you?" "Hospital Corpsman, 2nd Class George Rowe, sir." "A corpsman?" "Yes, sir." The lieutenant was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know how to write a report?" "Yes, sir." "Write one. Tonight. Everything that happened here. I'm putting you in for a commendation." "That's not necessary, sir." "It wasn't a suggestion, sailor." The lieutenant left. Mitchell finally moved, stood up, swayed, caught himself on the gun pit wall. His eyes were yellow, jaundice. His malaria was getting worse. "You should be in sick bay," Doc Rowe said. "So should you." That was probably true. Doc Rowe felt like he'd been awake for a week. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw muzzle flashes and falling men. "Come on," Mitchell said. "Let's get some coffee, or whatever passes for coffee here." They walked back toward the American lines. Behind them, a work detail was already gathering the dead, Japanese and American both. They'd be buried in the same ground, enemies in life, neighbors in death. War made strange accommodations. The story of Doc Rowe holding a machine gun nest on Guadalcanal spread through the 1st Marine Division like malaria. Within a week, everyone knew. The corpsman who'd become a gunner. The medic who'd killed more Japanese in one night than some infantry squads killed in a month. Some men treated him like a hero. They'd slap his back, buy him drinks from their personal stashes, ask him to retell the story. Doc Rowe hated it. He didn't feel heroic. He felt like he'd failed, abandoned his real job to do something any Marine could have done. Other men treated him differently, quieter. They'd nod when they passed him. Say nothing, but their eyes showed understanding. They knew what killing did to you. They knew the weight. Lieutenant Commander Harrison called him into the aid station on November 2nd. The surgeon looked tired. He always looked tired. Guadalcanal was eating him alive, same as everyone else. "Rowe," Harrison said, "I read your report." "Yes, sir." "It's accurate." "Yes, sir." Harrison lit a cigarette. He didn't offer one to Doc Rowe. "You understand what you did was outside your assignment?" "Yes, sir." "You understand that corpsmen are non-combatants, that we don't carry weapons, that our job is medical support, not combat?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Harrison blew smoke toward the ceiling. "Now forget all that. This is Guadalcanal. The rules don't apply here. If you see a gun that needs firing and no one else to fire it, you fire it. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "You saved lives that night, Rowe. The wounded men in this aid station would have died if the Japanese broke through. You prevented that." Harrison stubbed out his cigarette. "But I need you as a corpsman more than I need you as a machine gunner. So when this is over, when the shooting stops, you go back to being a medic. Clear?" "Yes, sir." "Dismissed." Doc Rowe left. Outside, the jungle screamed with birds and insects. Somewhere distant, artillery rumbled. The war continued, indifferent to any individual's moral struggle. He thought about Harrison's words. You saved lives by taking lives. The logic was sound, utilitarian, necessary, but it didn't change how his hands felt when he picked up his medical bag. They felt wrong, like they belonged to someone else, like they belonged to a killer. Guadalcanal ended in February 1943. The Japanese withdrew. Henderson Field stayed American. The Marines moved on to the next island. Doc Rowe moved with them. He participated in 4 more major campaigns: New Georgia, Bougainville, Guam, Iwo Jima. He treated hundreds of wounded men. He saved countless lives. He became one of the most decorated corpsmen in the Pacific Theater, but he never fired a weapon again. Not because he couldn't. He'd proven he could. Not because he was afraid. Fear had nothing to do with it. He didn't fire because he'd made a choice that night on Guadalcanal, a choice about who he wanted to be. Private First Class James Mitchell survived Guadalcanal. He survived the war. He went home to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 kids. He worked as a mechanic for 40 years. He died in 1989, age 66, surrounded by family. He never spoke about the war, not even to his wife. But every year, on October 24th, the anniversary of that night, he'd pull out a photograph, a black and white image of young men in dirty uniforms. In the photo, Doc Rowe sat on the edge of a gun pit, cleaning his medical instruments. Mitchell stood beside him, rifle in hand. Both men were smiling. The smiles looked wrong, like they'd forgotten how. The human capacity for violence is bottomless. We know this. History proves it endlessly. But equally bottomless is the human capacity for choice, for deciding, in moments of impossible pressure, who we want to become. Doc Rowe had a choice that night. He could have run, left the gun, saved himself, let others handle the killing. No one would have blamed him. He was a medic. Combat wasn't his job. But he stayed. And in staying, he saved every wounded man in that aid station, every Marine too injured to fight, every soldier who'd trusted that someone would stand between them and death. He became, for one night, the thing he'd never wanted to be, a killer. And then, when morning came, he became something else, a man who'd done what needed doing and chose to live with it. The Navy Cross, the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts. Doc Rowe received them all. He attended the ceremonies, stood at attention, saluted when required, but he never wore the medals after the war ended. He went home to Pennsylvania, became a teacher like he'd always wanted. History, taught high school for 32 years. His students never knew he'd fought in the Pacific. He didn't tell them. What was there to say? That war turns men into machines, that killing becomes routine, that you can stack bodies in the mud and feel nothing because feeling would break you? They wouldn't understand. How could they? In 1985, a journalist tracked him down. A piece about Guadalcanal veterans. The journalist had read the after-action reports. He wanted to interview the famous corpsman who'd held off a banzai charge single-handedly. Doc Rowe declined, politely, firmly. "That wasn't me," he said. "That was someone I had to become for a few hours. I don't know him anymore." The journalist pushed, offered money, offered publicity, offered to tell his story to the world. Doc Rowe closed the door. He died in 1994, age 75, heart attack, quick, painless. His wife found him in his study, sitting in his favorite chair, a book open on his lap. He'd been reading Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms. At the funeral, 3 men in marine dress blues appeared. Old men now, gray-haired, thick around the middle. They'd flown in from across the country. They stood in the back of the church during the service, didn't speak, didn't approach the family. After everyone else had left, they approached the coffin. Each man saluted. Each man placed something inside, a combat patch, a dog tag, a spent brass casing. One of them was James Mitchell. He was 81. His hands shook with Parkinson's, but his salute was perfect. "He saved my life," Mitchell told Doc Rowe's widow. "He saved all of us." She didn't understand. Her husband had never talked about the war. She knew he'd been in the Pacific. She knew he'd been a medic. But that was all. Mitchell told her the story, all of it. The gun pit, the bonsai charge, the night a corpsman became a fortress. When he finished, she was crying. "He never said anything," she whispered. 50 years. He never said a word. "Some men can't talk about what they did," Mitchell said. "It's too big. It changes you in ways you can't explain." Did it change him? Mitchell thought about that. "No," he said finally. It revealed him. There's a difference. Guadalcanal today is quiet. The gun pits have eroded. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefield. Tourists visit Henderson Field, now Honiara International Airport, without knowing what happened in the trees beyond the runway. The Japanese cemetery holds 3,000 graves. The American cemetery holds 5,000. They face each other across a valley where nothing grows right anymore. The soil is still full of metal, bullets, shell fragments, the physical residue of violence. But the real residue is elsewhere, in the minds of men who survived, in the families they built, in the students Doc Rowe taught who learned history from a man who had lived it but never spoke of it, in the children and grandchildren of James Mitchell who grew up not knowing their grandfather had fought alongside a legend. The story lives in silence, in the things we don't say, in the weight we carry without complaint. That's the real legacy of men like Doc Rowe, not the medals, not the commendations, not the official recognition. The legacy is the choice they made to become what they had to become, do what they had to do, and then, crucially, become something else again. To not let war define them forever, to save others at the cost of themselves, and then to live with that cost, quietly, without seeking glory or recognition, to teach history without mentioning their place in it. To be heroes who refuse to be called heroes, that's rarer than any medal, harder than any battle. That's the man George S. Doc Rowe was. A corpsman who held a machine gun for one night on a rotting island in the Pacific, and then spent the rest of his life being exactly what he'd always wanted to be. A healer, a teacher, a man at peace. War found him, tested him, transformed him, but it didn't break him. He held the line. Not just that night on Guadalcanal, but every day after. Held the line between violence and humanity, between what war demanded and what his soul required, between the killer he'd become and the man he chose to remain. In the end, that's the only battle that matters, the one we fight with ourselves, the one that determines not whether we survive, but who we are when we do. Doc Rowe won that battle every single day, and that's a story worth remembering.